I know a historian called Robert Lyman who's an absolute expert in this. He's the man who knows everything about this subject. He was saying Pearl Harbor was almost a distraction, really. Keep the American Navy from getting involved in what they wanted to do, because they really wanted to just expand. And they did, really. They succeeded very quickly. Probably too quickly, because I think they spread so far and wide that it was probably not possible to control it once they'd done it, because obviously once you've made that many enemies as well, and you've spread yourself so thin, there's at least going to be parts of you that are vulnerable. But well, and as well, by the time the Kohima battle started, the Japanese really, they weren't putting on any offensives at all. This was the very last land offensive that they had tried. It was a very, very much last-ditch effort.
You could say Kohima is sort of the higher watermark of the expansion of the Japanese Empire.
Yeah,
in the sort of westward, anyway.
Yes, yeah.
So yeah, I mean, they expanded all the way down. They took Singapore, famously, one of the British Empire's worst, in fact, one of our biggest surrenders ever, if not the biggest single surrender of men, was at Singapore.
Yeah.
And, you know, they were starting to push on to, is worrying they might try and invade Australia and things.
Yes.
But it's interesting to note that we're going to be talking really about Burma and on into India itself. And so I'll put map up in post, as always. But from a map, you can see that India and China have got a massive border with each other, which is largely the Himalaya range.
Yes.
However, if you get to the end of the Himalaya range, going eastwards, you end up at Burma or Myanmar. And so it can be described that Burma is a land bridge, in inverted commas, between India and China.
Yes, because the Himalayas, the eastern end of the Himalayas, they're called the Hump. They nicknamed it the Hump, which is where they took the supplies from Assam over into China.
So you'd have to fly over the hump.
Yeah, because obviously you can't, there's no other way around. So, which is apparently a horrible thing to do as well. It's really dangerous.
Well, yeah, I think, because the peak of Everest is up around cruising range, so cruising altitude. So, it wouldn't be a pleasant flight, I wouldn't have thought.
Not in an unpressurized cabin.
And so the Japanese, they started to invade Burma sort of straight away, that is to say early in 1942, so not long after Pearl Harbor. Within a few months of Pearl Harbor, Japanese troops were pouring into Burma. Now, where, as I say, maybe the very low resolution people think it was just the United States versus Japan. Well, it's actually the French, because Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, was French. There were lots of Dutch territories.
Yeah, the Dutch East Indies.
Right.
Yeah.
So actually, really, it was the United States, Great Britain, the Dutch and the French all had interests.
Yes.
And then, of course, India itself. I mean, India was part of the British Empire, and we had sort of one of their biggest capitals was in Calcutta, which is on that side of India. And so the British Empire is, a mixture of people as well. There was like Gurkhas involved and Australian troops, obviously Scots and Irish and Welsh. And
the actual, the Indian Army, the British Indian Army at Kohima was, I think it was over 80% Indian.
Right.
And it was, the Second World War kind of encouraged the British to recruit from other parts of India that weren't considered soldierly. So they actually had a mix of every part of India, that's the first time that had happened. And then consequently, when we left, when we withdrew from India altogether in 1947, we actually left them with a really decent army, which you need. If you're going to be a country, you do need it. So they really benefited from that.
And railroads.
And
civil service.
Yes.
Left them with lots of things, actually.
Lots of naughty stuff as well.
And so, I will mention Singapore was one of our worst surrenders.
Yes.
One of our longest, I think it might be the longest fighting retreat, was across Burma. So the Japanese army invade.
Yes.
And the British army of what was there sort of essentially fought a very, very long, extended fighting retreat.
Yes.
All the way back, ultimately, mainly across northern Burma, all the way ultimately back into India itself.
Did a lot of them actually came through Kohima? A lot of the refugees. They set up stations, like cookhouses and everything, so they could feed them as they came through. Because, like you say, you had the army fighting a fighting retreat, but also you have a massive amount of people because a lot of Indians lived in Burma, and as soon as the Japanese invaded, the tables just turned completely, and the Burmese wanted them out. So there was a huge amount of people moving, and a lot of people died.
Well, because everyone had seen how the Japanese treated the peoples under them, for example, in China, in all throughout the 30s. The Japanese, especially sort of the military police and things, could be very, very brutal.
Yes.
And the British Empire, for all its faults, was just not not the same beast.
No.
So people would rather live under the British Raj than the Imperial Japanese yoke. I mean, it was a no-brainer to nearly everyone. It seemed.
Yeah, I think if you're going to choose one between one or the other, then
Right.
yeah, certainly.
And so the Japanese controlled Burma all this time. And as you mentioned, a lot came through Kohima. Again, I'll put a map up so everyone knows exactly what I mean. And I've said this in all sorts of epochs. It's true all over the world, especially in places where there's not a great deal of roads and a great deal of railways, is that you end up being funneled through some very specific valleys, quite often,
Yes,
some
yeah.
very specific passes. There's just sort of no other way around it. And anyway, Kohima and Imphal are on those. It's sort of, if you're going to go on foot or on a wagon or on a horse, even on a car, if you're going to go from northern Burma into India, there's just a very few, I think two main places you're going to be funneled into. And this is the small town of Kohima and another slightly bigger place, Imphal.
Imphal, yes. Right? Well, yeah, there was only one main road, and went through both, but that runs north-south. But the Japanese, the refugees first came east to west, and then obviously the Japanese followed in 1944. But over no roads really. There was. They actually they sent a pioneer corps out, and they built bridges to try and make it as efficient as possible, and sorted all the tracks out so that when they marched through, they could cover the ground that they wanted to cover, because they had a time limit set by the rations, which was pretty insane. But yeah, well, that was a part of their undoing, but we'll come to that later.
So that is, I think, a big part of this story. Perhaps one of the sort of fundamental things to say near the beginning is that how few roads there were, and the nature of the terrain in northern Burma and that part of sort of extreme eastern India is, everyone agrees, some of the most extreme ground you can fight on.
Yeah, I think I would go so far as to say it's some of the most extreme ground you could go for a walk on.
Right.
Literally, it's you've got mountains, they're covered in jungles. The valley bottoms, if it's warm weather, it's deathly humid, horrible mosquitoes, leeches, and all that. And then you get up onto the mountain sides in the summer, in the hot months, it's absolutely boiling. It's red hot. And then when you get to the top of them mountains, you could be baking during the day, and then it could be hailstorms on a night. Like, they get some pretty extreme weather, even when it's not the monsoon. But then obviously when the monsoon hits, you're on mountains that are made of mud, basically then. And you can't, obviously, all the positions, nearly every position is always at the top of a hill. We're generally in a village, so yeah, you're always walking to the top of an hill, basically.
so it's jungle, rainforest, really. And I've been to some tropical parts of the world before, gone through jungle, and there's jungle, and then there's real hardcore jungle, and this is as crazy as it gets. I mean, anyone that knows about Vietnam and Vietnam experience, it's sort of that level. It's sort of as challenging as jungle can be, where there's giant insects, not most things. A lot of things are poisonous.
Yeah.
A lot of things are looking to kill you.
Basically,
Insects and plants and everything.
Well, my grandfather was a Chindit, and they were obviously in the jungle. And he said a few times, it's like, take the Japanese out of the equation completely, that would have still been awful.
Right, yeah.
It would have still been a real massive challenge.
Right.
To get over it. But
so a lot of them, the casualties are more from disease than from combat.
Yes, yeah.
So you mentioned the Chindits there. Let's before we get on to Kohima itself,
yes,
let's talk a touch about the Chindits. So it was the British and Americans actually. It's one of those things where different nations quite often like to take credit for things entirely. So we like to think, the British like to think, we fought the war against the Japanese in Burma. But there was a lot of Americans there.
There was, yeah.
And so when Japan took Burma, one of the things we did under General Wingate is to put together some sort of commando stroke early proto special forces chaps that got called Chindits.
Yeah.
And they were not parachuted, glided deep behind enemy lines, sometimes a couple 100 miles behind enemy lines, sometimes for months on end. Long range penetration groups.
That's what they call them. Yeah,
so like the SAS in North Africa, but for much longer, much deeper behind enemy lines. So like the SAS, but more intense, if anything. And these guys were called the Chindits.
Yes.
And your grandfather was one.
Yes, he was.
And their experiences were horrific by and large, weren't they?
Yeah, it didn't sound right nice. Definitely. I think he said he weighed about 5.5 stone when he came back out, and he was there he was out for 3 months.
That's close to death then, as an adult man, to be that.
Yeah, well, it's pretty much exactly the same size as me. So, like, I'm 5'8" or whatever, and I weigh 11 stone. So yeah, they were
it'd be close to organ failure and death. So he's lucky he survived.
Yeah, and I think really he probably got to that weight purely because he got all the way to the end of it. He managed to survive the whole thing. Because a lot of lads, they were coming out full of malaria or cholera, typhoid, all manner of diseases. And some of them,
is a big one.
Oh yes. Well, not only that, the Naga Hills apparently has a huge magnesium level in the water.
Oh really? I didn't know that. This is new to me.
So apparently, even without dysentery, it's going through you basically. So yeah. So they were, even if they weren't ill, they were probably suffering from diarrhea.
So exactly as you say, even take the Imperial Japanese Army out of the equation, to spend months on end, like you say, a couple of months, sometimes up to 5 months, I understand.
There was
deep in the jungle there, and
there's one African brigade that apparently were out for 9 months. They were out for the longest out of anybody.
Wow. So, and that's a survival ordeal.
Oh yeah.
Unless you really learn how to survive off the jungle, you're not going to make it.
No, you're brown bread. Yeah, definitely.
The leeches you mentioned, many accounts, lots of accounts are sort of the leeches, yeah, and sores. Well, you mentioned monsoon. During the monsoon season, obviously you're constantly drenched, really, drenched.
Yeah.
And when it's not monsoon season, it's so humid anyway that you're essentially wet through.
Yeah.
And you're supposed to be carrying giant packs. You're supposed to be marching all the time. One of the, as I'm sure you know, one of the sort of sayings of the Chindits, or informally anyway, if you don't march, you die. That was sort of accepted, not a saying, sorry. It was just an accepted fact that if you can't march, they probably will have to leave you behind.
Yes. And I think on Operation Longcloth in 1943, the first Chindit operation, and they marched in and marched back out. There was no gliders. It was all on foot. Well, that was I've forgotten my point.
Or a horrific experience for them.
Well, yeah. There was something specific about that I was going to say, but I can't remember what it was.
Well, the sores, because if your feet are so sore that you can't march anymore.
Sorry,
that's it.
That is what we're going to say. So basically, on the first operation, if you fell by the wayside, and they did use that phrase, those exact words, you were given like enough ammunition to kill yourself, basically. And you did just literally get left. Because there were a really, really minute amount of people who survived, and some of them went native, and they found them in 1944.
yeah.
When they went back, just living with natives. But by the time by the time Operation Thursday came about in 1944,
That's the second big
the
Chindit
second
operation.
big Chindit operation, it was a lot better organised. They had strongholds with actual airstrips, so that it was possible. It still wasn't a guarantee, but it was definitely much more possible to get people out. And the Nagas helped a great deal with the Chindits that operated around Kohima, specifically the Angami Nagas around there. They were instrumental, really.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.